I'm really excited and have the privilege of introducing today's impressive presenters, who each bring a unique perspective to our discussion for this workshop, what drives exciting and field-furthering research. So I'll tell you briefly about Dr. Allison Goldfein, who joined Novartis Institute in 2017 as Director of Translational Medicine for Cardiometabolic Disease, where she continues to work on drug discovery and development. Prior to this, she joined the Joslin Diabetes Center in Boston, initially for training, and then stayed on as faculty for 27 years and became the head of clinical research at Harvard Medical School. She has held multiple leadership roles, including participation in the Data Safety Monitoring Board of Industry and the NIH. She served as a voting member of the Endocrine Advisory Committee to the FDA. She has also served on the ADA Practice Guideline Committee and was chair of ADA's Clinical Research Grant Study Group. She's authored more than 175 manuscripts and chapters, including a chapter in the Williams textbook in endocrinology, which is our famous endocrinology textbook. And to tell you about Dr. Phillipson, Dr. Lou Philipson is an endocrinologist and truly a leading world authority on diabetes. He serves as founding director of the Kovler Diabetes Center at University of Chicago, where he's currently on faculty. He also served as the ADA 2019's President of Medicine and Science, and is also the past president of the ADA Chicago Northern Illinois Board. For more than 25 years, Dr. Philipson has explored many aspects of research, including insulin secretion and the genetics of diabetes, including monogenic as well as neonatal diabetes. He has served as principal investigator on numerous research projects and has presented his research worldwide. And he's been the recipient of numerous awards and accolades to the point where I feel like if I start talking about that, we won't be able to get to anything else. So just a reminder for you guys, if you have any questions for our presenters during the session, keep typing them into the Q&A box, just like you've been doing.
Recording in progress.
The enthusiasm has been really great, and we'll take the questions throughout the session and try to get to as many of them as we can before our time is up. But let's start first from hearing from our presenters. So we'll start with Dr. Goldfine. Dr. Goldfine, do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself as well as your background in research?
So I think that you actually gave a very kind background for me. Again, I started in a basic science training. I always asked, what is the clinical relevance of what we are doing in the laboratory to anchor it to something that was very important to me, and that's my patients with diabetes. And then I actually grew really in the ability to do the intricate physiology studies that underlie insulin secretion and action. And that's when I became head of clinical research at the Joslin Diabetes Center. And one of the projects went from something that was in the basic science about regulating inflammation into a multi-center NIH-funded clinical trial that was just really an incredible learning experience when you find something that is working and you go through switching from the proof of concept studies into the clinical development. And that led me to a transition into an industry-based role where, again, I serve right at the translation between discoveries in the laboratory that may be able to be moved into patients and then develop them into phase 2 and ready for phase 3 clinical trial development.
Thank you, Dr. Goldfine. And Dr. Phillipson, will you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Well, again, just like as Allison said, you did a great job sort of with the background, so I appreciate that. And of course, you and I know each other a long time. I think Allison's theme here of transitions is an interesting one. So there's all sorts of transitions in our lives, from fellowship to trying to figure out early faculty, and then the choice of a research problem, which is a little bit what we're going to talk about in the next couple of minutes. My transition really was from more basic science to translational science. So the first part of my career was really looking at electrical activity in insulin secreting cells. And while that was, I thought, incredibly important and would lead to all sorts of insights and was directly related to my clinical work, which I never stopped doing, it was not the same as working with people with diabetes. And so that really was the transition that I started about 15 years ago, was to figure out research problems that directly involved having people with diabetes as the subjects of the research. So I think that describes my career, and there's, like, in my mind anyway, a clear break point. But of course, it's a lot messier than that. But I think what we're going to try to talk about is how do you choose those research questions? It really does extend nicely from all the previous discussions about fellowship and mentoring, and this idea of choosing a problem that's important is something we could just keep talking about for days.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you guys tell us a little bit about what kind of model can one follow possibly to help them when they're trying to develop a research protocol, question, program overall?
So I think, first I would take one step back and say that, one of the really amazing things about medicine is that you can be a clinician, you can be a researcher, and you can be a teacher. And I think that when you talk about career paths, it's hard to do everything all at once, and you don't have to. You can do them to greater and lesser degrees over your career. And just as both myself and Dr. Phillipson have done, we've shifted a little bit over the time. And I think that both of us followed both passion, interest, and novel things that came in front of us. So I want to just say that I think that part of individuals who've been really successful, if your path that you set out at the beginning is very clear and your vision is very clear, one single path can get you from the beginning all the way to the end. But it's also possible to take diversions along the way, and you should be open to that. And then I'll just say one more thing before I'll turn it over to Lou, and that's that we are in medicine. And I think finding problems where there are unmet needs, and the unmet need can be a single patient with a unique problem, or the unmet need may be many, such as our problems with obesity and diabetes, and finding ways to ask a clinically relevant question. And you may answer that in a preclinical model or in a cell, or you may answer that in patients, or you may answer it in epidemiologic or data-based work, but finding a question and making sure that your question can come to an answer. Now, hopefully that answer will lead to advanced steps to develop it, but making sure that you have something that's relevant and that you can tie it to the relevance of medicine, whether it's a patient or many patients. Lou?
Right. So I think, as a fellow, you don't have necessarily choices to think about your own questions. I mean, you're there to find a mentor among the faculty. Hopefully you've considered that in terms of not only who's good to the fellows, but what are the important things that are there. So I think that's sort of step one. But then as you go on for a little bit and you say, well, okay, I'm going to have research as part of my life. So then what do I do? And I don't mean to say that I made a bad choice, having a basic science lab, but I think that it was problematic. And I do feel some, at the time there was some peak that we would be talking to like 10 other people at meetings where thousands of people were. And so that, if that's okay for you, that's still an important thing. Part of it is to be able to have an important problem enough for you to get excited about it, for you to be passionate about it, and for you to, of course, generate funding. Part of it then could be a spin-off of what you're doing with your mentor. Part of it could be understanding what is exciting in the field today. We've heard from other speakers and moderators in other sessions about how one does that. I think, though, for me, what really was the transition, and this is what Allison was just saying, is that sometimes a single patient can change your life. That's really part of my standard talk about my work lately, is sort of meeting one patient at the time, about 15, 16 years ago, who in this case had an unusual form of diabetes. I didn't really think at the time that my sort of entire career would be shifted to that. Those of you who heard one of the earlier sessions from our colleague in St. Louis was that this idea of atypical diabetes has grown on a lot of us. And sometimes it's that one patient, then the research around that patient, there are other problems that can generate enough interest to start a whole career. So part of this is thinking what floats your boat, what motivates you, what can you get passion around, so that you can also be excited about it, to work on it for a long time, but also to generate the funding necessary to keep going.
Yeah, this is really great. I feel like it's very interesting, actually, that both of you have truly great research careers, but your careers are both not only have they transformed from what they originally were, but they're so vastly different even with where you guys are now. So it's nice to see that there's a lot of opportunity that's quite varied within research. It's not just one thing that a lot of times people sometimes expect it to be, but the deeper they get, there's a lot of potential pathways even within research. And staying on this theme of transformation for a moment, maybe you can talk a little bit about once someone has designed their research and they're in trying to figure out how to make it work, and maybe the results aren't happening that are sort of expected from what they initially thought, how do you help transform a study like that so that it does follow with that model that you were previously thinking about?
You want to go first?
Sure.
No,
Allison, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So this is something that we talk about a fair amount, and that it's important to be able to distinguish when it doesn't go the way you anticipate it going, because you're doing something wrong, or is there a real lesson in front of you? And it's very challenging to separate those two instances. And there is an example that Lou and I have discussed recently, where there was an investigator, and he was looking at the relaxation and constriction of aortic rings, and he gets a new fellow in his lab, and these are no longer working experiments for him. And instead of sort of just retraining the fellow, he said, well, what's different here? And it turns out that the new fellow was denuding the aortic rings by handling them very roughly. And so he realized that when they weren't dilating properly, there had to be something within the endothelium of these aortic rings that was making them dilate. And he called it endothelial-derived relaxing factor. And it turned out to be nitric oxide. And this German, he gets a Nobel Prize. So it's really important, and it's a wonderful illustration of recognizing when there's a real learning experience if something is not turning out the way you anticipate it, versus saying, okay, I've designed an experiment and the answer is this is not the way forward for what it is, or the question that I was asking. And it's a very tough balance and to find. Lou, you want to add to that?
Well, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think one doesn't know necessarily that, the impact of what you're doing is going to be down the road. I mean, there are so many amazing models of scientists that one could follow. I think it took me a long while to realize that the people that I trained with were extraordinary, unique individuals, and you weren't going to be another this or that person, and you had to be you. I mean, so that's the other really important thing, is that you have to figure out what motivates yourself, and if it's looking at vascular endothelium, that's great, but then why? So you have to be able to put that together in a package that makes sense to you. One can go down rabbit holes, and this is, I say over and over again, I say, well, if a fellow comes to me or a postdoc and says, I'd like to do this, that, or the other, I say, well, yeah, those are all possible, doable projects, but why would you do that? I mean, and where does that go? So just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. I mean, so that's something to keep in the back of your mind. It shouldn't stop you cold necessarily from doing something, because, as I say, sometimes one thing leads to another. But if there's something so, captivating about that, you have to really weigh in your own mind where to go as opposed to what not to do. And there are different models of that. I think about some scientists who spent their entire career studying sort of a protein, which doesn't really happen so much anymore, but there are people who did that, who studied muscular dystrophy, or as Francis Collins did, or cystic fibrosis, I think is what he studied for a while. And other people, Max Perutz was a great scientist, won the Nobel Prize for studying hemoglobin his entire career. It wasn't clear necessarily everything that would come out of that, but so there was a motivation to learn more and more about that one thing. But I think for most of us, making an impact in a clinical problem is going to be its own reward at the end of the day. So those are some of the ideas that I would encourage you to do, and go to sessions, hear talks, see what makes you excited about what it is that other people are doing, and try, and then talk to them. I mean, we've heard today, it's astonishing how sometimes how few people will reach out to senior people, old guys like me, and say, well, should I do this or that? We're happy to hear from you and to help you decide, even if we've never met or there's no connection.
Great, thank you so much. I imagine there's still, well, first of all, I just wanted to say, please feel free to send your questions if you have any into the chat box, or you can even unmute yourself if you have a burning question. But I'm curious too, I think there's probably at least some people who are still trying to identify whether research is the right path for them or not. And I wanted to know if you guys have any suggestions or tips for, one, really what makes someone particularly successful in a research career position overall, or if you have any suggestions or tips for the fellows and the trainees to help them decide along their path. And maybe Dr. Phillipson, you can go first on this one.
Yeah, so it's such an interesting question. I think, we spend a lot of time trying to figure that out. And, there's just a book that came out by Hahnemann and Cass Sunstein, and I forget the third author, called Noise. It's the kind of book that we don't often suggest that, say, our endocrine fellows should read, but I think one of the things that I think is so important is to read widely in the little time that you have. It means, and that is where sometimes things come up. I mean, this book Noise is about things that affect our thinking. Hahnemann's previous book, based on his Nobel Prize work in thinking, was Thinking Fast and Slow, and how you think about problems becomes, I think, an indication of what might happen. But his point is that so much of what we use to make decisions about how people might or might not be successful is probably wrong. And how those metrics work out, it helps to be really smart, but it also helps to be well-read and motivated, and to recognize when things fall into your lap. I don't know that I've had particularly good strategies in doing that. It turns out sometimes some of the most tenuous fellows that I've had, who are the most insecure at the beginning, have turned out to be the most spectacular scientists. At least by now they've reached their mid-career. And so, Allison, I wonder what your experience is.
So I've had the same experience, but I would say that there's something that I've actually recommended to my trainees, and that's that you can train yourself to some degree. And it's to train yourself to ask questions. So if you read a paper, ask a question to yourself. If you go to a lecture, ask a question to yourself. What is something that's unknown from this? Where is something this might lead to? Where is a parallel of this with something else that I'm thinking about? And then don't be afraid, as Lou said, to reach out and either go to the literature and try to address it, to try to reach out to your mentors or those around you. And we are one world now. You can reach out to people all around the world who may have some ability to answer the question. And it's amazing, the people who reach out across, distances and institutions for potential answers to the questions. So rank those. Of course, you can't pursue every single question that you might have, and you have to figure out which ones are important. But you can train yourself to ask questions, and so the people who are really successful really do think in that way. And I think if you actually look at many of the very successful research individuals, it's not that they took something from absolutely nothing and discovered something completely brand new. There were many elements of the discovery already in existence, already being worked upon, and they were able to pull the things together in a very unique way. And so I think that the people who are most successful, you can begin, reserved, you can begin without much knowledge in an area. But when you ask questions, those are the people who end up, I think, in my opinion, more likely to succeed. And I can see you nodding your head in agreement there.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I one of the things that I do, or that I've done over time, is sort of think about how people get to be successful and what drives them and motivates them. So I think it's exactly the right question. But two of the quotes that occur to me, and Allison and I discussed this, that was one of them. When I was in high school, I think I read everything Isaac Asimov ever wrote. So that's a lot because he wrote like 300 books. And there was a time when I think he wrote like one a week. But he was inspirational, and some of you have seen, I mean, movies like I, Robot, which is already probably old school for you guys, but so much of what he wrote was also about science. And he was a biochemist at BU. He was actually on the faculty while he was writing some of his fiction. And one of the quotes from him that I like is he said, "The most exciting phrase to hear in science, the one that heralds the most discoveries, is not eureka, I found it, but that's funny." And so when you say, gee, that's funny, and on a result, that can be the insight that leads to something else. It's important. Just last week, I was on the FDA panel for Tuplusimap, which is it may be, if it's approved, one of the only agents to delay or even slow down type 1 diabetes. And what's been the driving force of Tuplusimap for the last 30 years is one of our colleagues, Kevin Herold at Yale. And what Kevin has done tirelessly is go through the data and try to pull out subsets of individuals who did respond or didn't respond, to work through various statistical insights to understand what could be pulled out from that. And through really his own motivation, over no less than 30 years, the drug is now very close to getting to market. I could also just echo what Allison said a few minutes ago by quoting the Nobel Prize winning physicist I. Rabi, who said that when he was growing up, his mother didn't say, "How did you do in school today?" She said, "Did you ask any good questions today?" And you've seen that probably over and over again, but that's something that I'll never forget also in terms of teaching other people how to think and how to design experiments.
That's really great. I think I'm hearing some themes of don't pigeonhole yourself into a box and assign yourself a trait of being good at something or bad at something, but really focus more on the questions, which I think is really great in medicine too, because we tend to think that we always have to have the answers. And it's an interesting mind shift to start thinking about what questions can I ask to learn more, rather than thinking you need to be the one who has all the answers all the time. The answers often come when you ask the right questions. So that's really great. Those are really good suggestions. So I know we have, I think, about 4 minutes left, and I really want to make sure if anyone has questions that we definitely get to those. So I'll pause for just a second. And so please feel free to get those in if you do have any burning questions. But I can definitely keep asking you guys questions, but I really want to find out if Dr. Goldfine or Dr. Phillipson, is there something else that you think would be really important to be said during this workshop?
Well, while Allison's thinking, so, I've heard in one of the other workshops, people saying, well, what can I do? There was someone had a visa problem and felt they couldn't see patients. I think there's so much that you can do to add on. And one of the studies that I think is about to launch is one by a company called Vertex, which recently bought a company called SEMA, which was started by Doug Melton, who's not a practicing physician, but who is a developmental biologist. His work on basically, I think, toad developmental biology changed dramatically when first one child and the other developed type 1 diabetes. Now he's been leading the world the last few decades, or one of the world's leaders in understanding beta cell development. Now there's going to be clinical trials. So I think there's lots of ways to get involved at any stage. If you haven't had experience in doing that, I think one of the previous speakers suggested just jumping in. Can I be helpful, and trying to see how people have gotten to their place, and don't just sort of accept what the study is doing.
I would actually really emphasize that, and I would say, that medicine and research is a team sport, and come in with passion, come in with an interest in learning. Come in asking, additional questions, because there is always more than one. And if you have a subspecial talent or insight that you can bring to the group, you will be valued. And I think that that would be my emphasis on what Lou just said.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Phillipson and Dr. Goldfine. And we probably have about a minute left, so if something comes up, please feel free to chime in still. But I just want to say thank you so much to both of our panelists today. You guys really always have great insight. And again, I really love that you are helping to demonstrate how varied careers in research can be, and all of your suggestions and tips are highly, highly appreciated.
I hope it was helpful. And as Allison and I both feel that if any of the fellows want to reach out to us at any stage, you know, bounce off an idea or just talk about it, we're also available. So it would be good to hear from people if that would be helpful.
I'm really going to encourage you guys to reach out. I think during fellowship especially, it's so great to build a network. And I think you never know when potentially those networking opportunities become really, really valuable in the future. So I remember with Dr. Goldfine, she had written an article when I was still in fellowship, and I saw her afterwards, and I was so excited to meet you, Dr. Goldfine, because I loved this article you had, and it's cool to see this all come around.